All right. And we're live.
I think so.
All right. Well, we'll find
Alive
out.
or live?
Oh, I'm alive. Live? I don't know. We'll see. Hold on, I'm checking. Yes, we are. We are live. We are
All
indeed
right.
live.
So, welcome everybody to Facts on the Ground. Welcome to our Sunday cast. And we are planning on doing many more of these live streams in the near and distant future.
Now that I'm a literal tech genius.
Right. And I'm getting there. I'm still waiting for my certificate in the mail. But we are more than happy to kick off this new era for us with none other than Vanessa Beeley. She is an independent journalist who's based in Syria, and she's reported on the war on Syria for many, many years now, as well as other wars and conflicts in the region. And she recently published a piece at Off Guardian titled 75 Years and Counting, A History of Western Regime Change in Syria, which is going to be the basis of our discussion today. So, Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us again.
All right. Thanks for having me on. And I'm glad I'm at the start of a new era.
It's so sad that we're I've been with Jesse for like a year and a half and we're just now figuring out how to live stream. But to be fair, I did have crap internet for like the first 9 months of that. Sleepy Josh laughed at me. That's how bad it was. So we did have a bit of an excuse there, but now I have decent internet, and I again am a literal tech genius. I like to joke all the time that I am now a member of Anonymous. I'm very fancy with my tech skills. I'm not really. I can push a few buttons. That's about it. I'm really not very bright when it comes to tech stuff, but here we are. I figured it out.
Hey, you got us live.
Yeah, I did.
So, Vanessa, let's start with the piece I just mentioned that you published with Off Guardian. What compelled you to write this piece, this historical analysis?
Very comprehensive.
From 1946 up until 2012.
I think what really compelled me was, although, Syria really has achieved an extraordinary, probably unprecedented, apart from perhaps Vietnam, victory over imperialism, both military, and we're heading towards, I believe, a kind of normalization, a gritted teeth normalization, as I call it, with President Assad. The US has effectively recognized the fact that it's not going to win this war on any front, on the economic front, on the military front, on the political front. It's been losing favor since 2016. It's been going down the pan. But unfortunately, my belief is there are certain members of the independent journalist community who are maintaining some of the narratives that actually enabled this war in the first place. Of course, all those narratives are very well known, that Syria is a police state, it's an authoritarian regime, Assad is a brutal dictator, political prisoners are literally kind of pouring out of every household. And this is what I object to, is this kind of reductionist narrative. And in many cases, it's being reproduced by people that have never visited Syria, that will not debate this entire subject publicly. Even on Twitter, when they are challenged by Syrians, they don't engage. For whatever reason, personally, I don't call this journalism, because I think whatever the risk to your reputation, whatever the risk to your brand, you have a duty as a journalist to analyze and to investigate and to draw conclusions based on all the facts.
Yes.
Not just on anecdotal evidence from someone who told you that this happened, or someone that's got a... Yeah, I mean, let's face it, all of the media coverage of the Syrian war is based on anonymous sources. It's based on very spurious, Qatari-funded, British-engineered reports to criminalize the Syrian government. But what I felt was really important was to put this into historical context, so that if someone is coming up with this statement, yeah, but, you know, okay, we disagree with US imperialism, we disagree with military intervention, we disagree with all that, but Syria is a police state. Look, basically, you can't be anti-imperialist on the one hand and then kind of amplify the imperialist talking points, the CIA talking points, the MI6 talking points, unless you can seriously evidence it. And by evidence it, I mean not New York Times kind of cartoon version of an investigation into alleged events that took place in Syria, right? Effectively, you're buying into the trial by media. Nobody is a dictator. Nobody is a war criminal. Nobody is guilty of any of these charges until they are proven in court. So my point is, with this article, I wanted to provide some, and you say it's extensive. I reached.
It is though, and I know you said it's not, like, obviously the history of Syria is vast. Like, it would take you know, books and books and books. But I mean, this is, as far as an article goes, it's very comprehensive.
Yeah, and I mean, this is what I wanted to do, and I wanted to leave out a lot of the analysis. You know, I wanted to try and leave out my slant on the information. I just wanted to present it and maybe nudge here and there and say, isn't this strange that in 1986 they were planning regime change, using the Muslim Brotherhood as a weapon to replace the secular government with an Islamist regime in order to secure resources, et cetera, et cetera. Doesn't this sound kind of familiar? And it happened in 1949. It happened in 1957. It happened in...
the U.S. is not very creative with its... You know what I mean?
Yeah,
they do the same
exactly.
playbook. Yeah.
You know, and the CIA has effectively been running clandestine military operations in Syria from 2004 to 2008, which it finally admitted, but wouldn't give any details of those military operations. Right. So I guess my point is, and the former UK ambassador to Syria in 2003 to 2006, Peter Ford, actually said, he said, well, of course, you can probably call Syria a police state when throughout its existence, so since its independence from France in 1946, it has been effectively policing CIA operations against Syria in order to depose governments that they consider to be pro-communist. So that means, of course, pro-Soviet Union, pro-Russia, as it would be now. Anti-Israel, which of course means pro-Palestine, pro the resistance, so pro-Hezbollah, pro-Iran. Iran is a long-standing ally. And this has been the pattern. And of course, the other pattern is to secure resources. Of course, in 2000, the Qatari multi-billion pipeline was proposed, which would, of course, have the backing of the United States in 2009. It's very well known that in 2009, President Assad basically turned his back on the US-backed pipeline in favor of the Iranian, Russian-backed pipeline. So, you know, but the thing is, and even for me, it was a really fascinating exercise to go back and start making all the connections. And I could have gone on forever, as you said. Yeah. I think I arrived at 7,000 words and thought, okay, I'm going to stop at 2012 because I'm going to be here forever. And the editors of Guardian are going to kill me. They already did.
I'm a history nerd. Like, I love history. So I love when people do like these really deep dives into the historical, context. Like there's never any context given when we're discussing what's happening in Syria today. Like they just talk about it as if it's like this thing that's happening in a vacuum. And there's decades and decades and decades of stuff that has led us to this point, and nobody ever talks about that aspect. But you brought up like the independent media thing, and this bothers me to no end, because you're right. There are a lot of people who I think know better, I don't know. And again, I don't know if it's their fear that it's going to damage their brand or whatever, but their just willingness to passively regurgitate empire propaganda is really disturbing. And it's people who are, putting themselves on the left, or people who are claiming to be anti-imperialist. And when they do things like call Syria a police state, or call Assad a brutal dictator, or whatever, without ever having spoken, like you said, to actual Syrians, to people who live there or who are from there, it's really disturbing to see. It's a huge problem in independent media right now, and it's not just with Syria; it's with other issues as well. But it's really disturbing to see this trend of people being more concerned about getting demonetized or losing Patreons or whatever than they are about telling the truth.
It's brand protectionism, basically. At best. And I think
journalistic malpractice. I don't consider a lot of these people journalists. Like I'm not a journalist. I don't consider I'll name names. Somebody like Jackson Hinkle, not a journalist. He's a commentator. And that's fine. That's not to bash him for being a commentator. I think that's that's what I do. But these people kind of portray themselves in a journalistic light. And if this is the way that you're doing it, and you're not actually speaking to people on the ground in Syria, or at least not even making an effort to do so, and you're just regurgitating the things that you're hearing from, U.S. State Department crap. I mean, it's a real disservice to your audience, I think.
And a big part of the problem is that these self-styled journalists are so immersed in the culture of breaking the story, getting the scoop, being the first one to the scene, and they have no patience or wherewithal to go back into the history of Syria and research all of the regime change operations that the West has been waging there since, you could argue, even before Syria gained its independence. We can go back to Sykes-Picot as a starting point. And in fact, to that point, just to bring Sykes-Picot up to more of the present, there was a video that ISIS put out in its early days, you could call them, where a bulldozer plowed across the border between Iraq and Syria, and there was a handwritten message that was zoomed in on the video saying something to the effect of, "This is the end of Sykes-Picot." So that history informs the perspective and the strategies and the positions of the Wahhabi Contras. And, that's going all the way back to the early 20th century. And if you don't understand that, and then everything that follows from that, you can't make anywhere near an honest assessment of where Syria is right now, or where it's been in the past decade.
For example, to give you a very clear example, we know that, for example, the Caesar report, which has been forensically discredited by sort of activist journalist, veteran Rick Sterling, and I thoroughly recommend everyone read his report. I think it was originally published at Dissident Voice, but there's actually a link to a 30-page document completely debunking the entire report, which of course was commissioned by Qatar using Carter Ruck. So, again, you have empire's hands on this report right from the very beginning, right? And the majority of the kind of Amnesty International reports condemning the torture of prisoners. The Amnesty International itself had to walk back its Sadnaya report, partly because Peter Ford, again, the British ambassador who had visited the site, said, look, this is ridiculous. it can't even hold, I can't remember the number, but the numbers they were claiming sort of, I think around 50,000, maybe, I could be wrong, but they were huge numbers. And he said, this is ridiculous. This is a tiny prison. And it has traditionally been used to hold some of the most extremist terrorist group members and leaders throughout history, right? And the residents of Sadnaya, including a Christian monastery that came under attack from those terrorist groups, would not want those Islamist prisoners released from Sadnaya. So again, it's like when they talk about corruption and they talk about poverty in this country, and Antonio Guterres now is trying to bring together a kind of NATO-backed political settlement based on the poverty, the analysis of the high poverty levels in Syria, but without mentioning the war, without mentioning sanctions. It's ridiculous.
Yes.
And this is the point, all of these arguments, if these people, even if they were genuine commentators, let me give you a different example. Primo, right? Primo Radical. I actually messaged him on Twitter. I said, look, I'd love to come on to actually talk about this labeling of Syria as a police state, because I think it was Chomsky had in a very recent interview called Assad a monster. God. And all the rest of it, and condemned anyone who's against vaccinations to starvation and segregation, et cetera, et cetera. It's just disgusting.
Yeah,
but,
using the comparison of obeying traffic laws.
Yes. It's like we've reached the point of shut the fuck up, Noam. Like, just shut the fuck up. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like, I personally have, I will always have respect for Noam Chomsky. He was instrumental in my radicalization, reading his work and listening to him speak years and years and years ago. But like, I outgrew him. I think most of us have outgrown him. He just needs to stop talking, please.
Look, nobody maintains a tenured position at MIT. Right. I mean, these are the little kind of alarm bells that people, take what he says that's worthy and use it.
Yes, because he does say some great things.
Of course, and he has done in the past. But honestly, now he's kind of borderline fascist, to be honest. In the way 100%. He's speaking.
He wanted to starve people. Like, it's their problem if they don't want to get vaccinated and they can't eat. Well, they can starve. What the fuck?
And they should be segregated. In other words, we should be put in camps. Well, hold on, Chomsky.
Terrible, terrible.
But I think the difference is, with Primo, like, he responded immediately positively and asked me on.
No, I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, I really like Primo. I like Primo a lot.
And this is the thing, you can be a commentator. I don't know everything about everything.
Right.
But if I want to sort of talk about something, if I want to deep dive into something, I will bring someone on, or I will interview someone that knows a lot more about it than I do, that has a lot more experience, and who can enrich my knowledge and enrich the knowledge of my audience.
Yes.
Right.
That's literally the whole point of our show. Like, when Jesse and I first got together, we were like, we just want to bring on people who are smarter than us to talk about things that we're interested in.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
And this way I learn and the audience learns.
Yes.
But the thing is that a lot of these commentators who as I say, are regurgitating these intelligence office talking points on Syria are not apparently prepared to debate it publicly. Now, I don't quite understand how it will damage their brand if they bring somebody on that they can argue against my viewpoint. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely fine. We can debate civilly about it, or with Kevork.
But no, here's the thing. Yeah, here's the thing, because when we had Kevork on, who's amazing, I mean, he's incredibly knowledgeable. We've had him on a couple different times. But as soon as we had him on, why are you platforming a Nazi? Why are you platforming a fascist? Why are you know what I mean? Like that. And that's what you get. It's platforming. You can't platform people who other people disagree with. And you know what I mean? Like, so there's this fear that if you have someone on that, your audience may disagree with, or that your audience may have a, preconceived idea about, that you're going to get lambasted, and then you're going to lose your viewership. And frankly, I don't care. Like, I know that there are those people who do, and who are worried about building their brand and worried about building their viewership. But like, we've been from the beginning, it's the only reason why I joined up with Jesse. conspiracy is because we both had the same idea. We're never going to do this for clicks and views. We want to like just talk about things that are important with people who know more than we do. And that's, you know, and it's sad that there aren't more people like that. It's, you know, it really sucks.
Yeah, because, you know, even if you disagree, I mean, for example, I did an interview with James Delingpole, who I think was a supporter of Israel. I think he's gone like further the other way now. So. But, you know, this is the thing.
He's an interesting guy. I just watched
really
an interview he did with, I just watched an interview he did with Catherine Austin Fitts. I don't know if you're familiar with her.
Yeah, sure.
And the Solari report. But that was an interesting interview.
Yeah.
No, I want to go watch it. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I recommend it.
I like listening to people I don't agree with on everything. I like talking to people I don't agree with on everything. I like hearing other people's viewpoints. That's how you learn. Like, that's how you grow and you expand your knowledge. And I don't have to agree with you on everything. We can have a conversation, find points what we agree on. We can have a disagreement civilly, and we can talk about those things and try to inform each other on our different viewpoints and then move on with our day. I don't know why that's so complicated. It's weird.
Exactly.
It's weird. It is really weird.
And so I guess, you know, you asked what my motivation was in writing this, and I certainly haven't finished it. I've got to go from now 2012, and I might branch out into kind of what happened in Lebanon at the same time and how that has had impact. I kind of touched on it with the assassination of Hariri, and then the later assassination, or the 1 year later assassination of Pierre Gemayel. And of course, that has now a kind of, that's the thing, when you start doing this kind of deep dive, you start making so many connections. Had I made this analysis, honestly, it would have been a book, and really nobody would dare edit it. But, you know, if you look at so many elements of the history of CIA intervention in Syria, whether it's clandestine, whether it's kind of a little bit more overt, whether it's black ops, whether it's military, whether it's intelligence, there are so many connections to what has been happening since 2011. And, you know, as we've been arguing for a very long time, this entire operation, this regime change war, had been planned at least a decade before 2011. And when you go into the history, you can see that, you know, the US was never going to allow a government like Bashar al-Assad and his fathers, Hafez al-Assad, to exist or to remain. You know, their entire MO has been to find a way to remove these regimes and to replace them. Of course, they kind of cloak it in, they want a moderate Sunni regime made up of Sunni businessmen. Why? Because that will open the door to US trade, US aid, US, you know. But of course, what this means for the Syrian people is effectively a Muslim Brotherhood regime. And, you know, even the CIA, I can't remember at which stage, they sort of said, look, you know, the Syrian people are pragmatists. I think it was during the CIA uprising in between 1980 to 1982. I get mixed up in the dates because there are so many.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy, you know, from 46 until 57. I mean, in the space of about 2 years, there was something like 4 or 5 coups d'etat.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them, you know, to overturn someone that was pro-communist. That was their biggest threat at that point. To someone who was pro-CIA or who was a CIA man, then they were overthrown. And I mean, it was craziness.
Yes. Well, that's why I get bothered by the fact that people regurgitate this, because it's not like we don't have historical precedent. Like, this is what we do. We go into socialist or communist friendly countries. We overthrow their democratically elected leaders. We install a puppet dictator who's friendly to Western empire. And then we rape and pillage the country for their resources. I mean, that's what we do.
And we rewrite history.
Yes.
And you know, as you point out in your piece, Laith Marouf, a journalist who does very good work. He's based out of Lebanon, I believe. You point out that since the end of World War II, there hasn't been a Syrian president that hasn't been the victim, so to speak, of a regime change operation. And that speaks volumes. And I didn't know that until I read that. And I'm not saying I know everything about Syria. Obviously, none of us does, but I was surprised by that fact.
And Bashar al-Assad has been under constant attack, like not overt attacks, but there's constant efforts to, perform regime change in Syria. I mean, and has been since he showed that he was not going to play ball,
But also, I mean, this is, the thing is also, I need to do separate articles on specific points. I mean, for example, I also published an article, I think it was at Off Guardian, after a conversation with Kevork about the fact that when you talk about a police state, and then if you look at the Syrian drama programs from about the 90s onwards, many of them ripped into the Syrian government, into the corruption, into the failure of the Syrian government to deal effectively with the Muslim Brotherhood, in other words, to be tougher after the CIA engineered uprising in the 80s, which of course was put down in Hama and massively misrepresented by Western media, who claimed tens of thousands of deaths. In fact, the real figure is around 2,000.
I wanted to ask you about that specifically, because in reading Robert Fisk, particularly in his book, The Great War for Civilization, he refers at least once, I think more, to the massacre at Hama. And I was wondering if you could clarify that from your perspective, from your research at least. And he claims somewhere around 15,000 people were suffocated underground on the orders of Hafez al-Assad.
Robert Fisk was very much against, I think, both Syrian governments. He was certainly against the government of President Assad. He's also very clear in his dislike of Hezbollah. And I'm pretty sure, I mean, I haven't actually read that book, that he wasn't that fond of Hafez al-Assad either. And of course, the dominant narrative, which would of course be being fed by the Muslim Brotherhood to Western media, is these large numbers were massacred in the final put down of the CIA orchestrated uprising. I mean, I don't know if Fisk goes into the detail on that. I have no idea. But this is the thing. It's history to a degree is rewritten. I have a huge amount of respect for Robert Fisk, but at the end of the day, he's an establishment guy. And I think a lot of these establishment guys work on the basis that they're not going to completely toe the line with Western foreign policy narratives. So they, for example, I mean, Fisk was the first on the ground in Douma after the alleged chemical attack. And he had the courage to call it out for what it is. So, kudos to him. But I think with all of these, I take what's important and I research what I'm not sure about. And if you read Stephen Gowan's book, Washington's Long War on Syria, he reiterates the fact that the number of dead in the final clashes in Hama were much lower, around 2,000. And that's the figure that I've kind of been told while I've been here, living here for the last 2 years and looking into all these events. I've gone to Hama. I've spoken to people there, to officials, to civilians, etc. All of them say, no, it wasn't this massive massacre. And also what is rarely reported or is kind of sidelined, very much as it has been during this war, the terrorist atrocities have been kind of, buried. I always remember when ISIS massacred, I think it was around 172 civilians in Sweden in June 2018. And we actually asked Jon Snow of Channel 4 why they hadn't covered it. And he said, oh, well, we haven't got anyone on the ground and, you know, we can't verify if it's true or not. I said, what? Seriously? You know, so this is what you're up against all the time. And of course, what is not spoken about is the 2 years leading up to 1982 are all the suicide bomb attacks here in Damascus, across all of Syria, massacring civilians. Here in Damascus, they blew up an entire gas station, right, and killed, I don't know, dozens of civilians and injured many more. They carried out the massacre at the Aleppo military academy, and the story that I've been told is they came in to massacre the Alawite, the Shia Muslim cadets. The Sunni Muslim cadets that refused to leave and demanded to stay with their comrades were actually massacred alongside the Alawite and the Shia cadets. So they perpetrated multiple atrocities before they were finally put down in 1982 in Hama. And that's where, coming back to these drama series, they actually criticized the fact that the Syrian government wasn't tough enough at that point on the Muslim Brotherhood insurgents. And in fact, they tried to kind of integrate them into political life, into civil society, to try and kind of dampen down this threat. But in reality, of course, that just gave them greater influence in the important institutions and structures here in Syria, ready for, I think, the mid-80s, and then coming forward to 2011. So the fact that these drama series were allowed to be produced and aired, and actually I think one of them that was very critical of the faith leaders here in Syria and of the corruption in the government itself, certain members of the government tried to get it taken down, and the presidency intervened and said, no, you know, under our constitution, these series can be aired. They can be, if you want to discuss them, etc., etc. And I'll give you a little anecdotal something that happened quite recently, and it might not have been picked up. But we had in one of the Syria news channels an interview with Faris Shahabi, who's an independent, or was an independent MP. He's the head of the Chamber of Commerce in Aleppo. He stayed in Aleppo throughout the 10 years and actually did a lot of good for the people of Aleppo during that time and during the occupation by the armed groups. Now, during that interview, certain things were said that upset the Ministry of Economy. So they actually demanded the resignation of 3 journalists. Ultimately, the presidency intervened again, reinstated the journalists, and demanded that the Minister of Economy come in.
What a dictator!
But this is the thing, right?
He's such a dictator.
This is the monster.
Right.
Yeah, it begs the obvious question, why is that not reported on? Why is it only...
It doesn't fit the narrative. That's why I get so frustrated
right.
when independent journalists just regurgitate the narrative, because
yeah.
we know that they're lying to us. Like, that's not a secret. They lie about everything. So why they're not, like, you know... And,
you know, if we're talking about context, if we go back to the political prisoner issue, so Bashar al-Assad came to power in 2000 after the death of his father and the death of his elder brother, who was the kind of heir apparent. And Bashar al-Assad was an eye doctor in London, was pulled back in and made president. Between 2001 and 2004, I believe, and this is according to Amnesty International and according to a kind of a lawyer who's very much opposed to the Ba'ath Party, to the Assad governance. Anwar Bunni is his name. There were reports vary, but there were a maximum 2,000 political prisoners in Syrian jails at this time, maximum. Other reports say less, say around 1200 to 1300. It depends who you're reading. I think Joshua Landis, Amnesty International, and Anwar Bunni. When Assad came into the presidency, he released between 600 and 800 of those political prisoners. So in 2004, I think there were certainly less than 1,000 political prisoners. And then you have to qualify what constitutes political prisoners. The majority of those prisoners were Muslim Brotherhood members who had been involved in or leaders in the various insurgencies backed by the CIA prior to the year 2000, right? So, you know, this is what I'm saying is when you're going to throw out statements like, you know, this is an authoritarian regime, it has committed atrocities against its own people, Assad is a brutal dictator. This has absolutely none of the depth that is required, right? To give you some understanding of the issues here. Look, of course there is corruption, but you will find corruption in any post-war society, to be quite honest, let alone a country that has been under attack effectively, as you said, since the Sykes-Picot, right? So from the early 20th century to now, Syria has been, and I can't remember exactly who it was who said that all roads to Damascus lead through Baghdad. So the Iraq invasion, for example, I think of this has been leading.
I think that was David Wormser.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I had a complete blank for a second.
Neocon par excellence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
and one of the writers of the Clean Break also.
You're right though. There's no context ever. And that's what I was saying earlier. There's no context ever given when to say Assad is a brutal dictator, you see videos of him like just chilling with the people at some diner down the street or whatever. He doesn't seem like an evil dictator to me. Or maybe I just don't know what an evil dictator is, but it's, you know, yes, he has to behave in a certain way. And I'm not like condoning. I mean, listen, I say this all the time. There is nobody in a position of power that doesn't suck. You don't get to that level of power without being kind of a scumbag. You have to be sort of ruthless to lead a country, especially, you know, and you know, it's just part of the job, really. So I don't like anybody who's in a position of power, but I think that we need to at least be honest in our assessment of these people and, you know, be factual with what we're talking about. And to me, somebody who's advocating for journalists, that doesn't equal evil dictator. You know?
No, I mean, he's advocating freedom of speech, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's actually instructing the Minister of Economy to come into the studio and debate with the journalist the points that were raised. In other words, I mean, I can't think this is a bit like kind of Solomon, you know, it's like the fairness of it. Okay, I'm not condemning the Minister of Economy for his reaction, but I'm saying to him, you have to be a grown-up and come in and talk about the issues that you feel were wrongly addressed, for example. You know, and this is the thing, you know, I honestly have to say that democracy is way more alive here in Syria.
For sure.
Than it is
and I don't live in Syria.
Else.
Yeah, I don't live in Syria, but I don't think that's, I think that's very accurate. I mean, they have a huge voter participation. You know, their elections.
And at the end of the day, it's not our business who they elect.
Right.
It's really not our business. And this is
really
the point. This is the point that Laith has made time and time and time again. And he made it really strongly after, I can't remember who it was, had commented about the police state and blah, blah, blah. And he said, how dare you? Look at the United States.
Yeah.
Look at how many political prisoners you have. Look at how many dissidents you have tortured and incarcerated, not only in the US, but globally.
Look at Australia now.
Globally. Yeah, Australia, UK. UK is torturing and incarcerating Julian Assange. In America, how many dissidents do you have in jail, in isolation? That's effectively torture, right?
Yes.
But that is bona fide, de facto torture, even being in isolation. And how many Black Americans, Latino Americans are killed every year by the police on the streets?
Or incarcerated into legalized slavery.
How many homeless?
Yeah.
I can go out right now on the streets of Damascus and barely see any homeless people or any people begging. Okay, there's probably more now than there was 10 years ago. But still, compared to Paris, compared to London, compared to, I haven't
the
been
United
to New York.
States.
Yeah.
Holy shit, Vanessa. We have a home. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. I live in a tiny town outside of Columbus, Ohio. And up until like the last 5 years, I never saw homeless people in my tiny town. And now there's homeless people everywhere. It's so sickening. It makes me sick. But I mean, in the United States, that's what I love, is that the United States feels like it has this moral authority over anybody on anything, and it's beyond absurd. It is beyond. We're the biggest hypocrites.
The sad thing is that kind of, I wrote about this quite a long time ago, that kind of exceptionalist. I mean, we were joking about it before we went live about, the US
time change.
But the exceptionalism is kind of a little bit in the DNA.
Yes.
And so even commentators who've some of them have been to Syria, but for a very, very short time. And in all honesty, after all the war was finished, and there wasn't an awful lot to kind of report on. And, they kind of cast this aspersion, well, yeah, it wasn't a democratic election. Hello? Okay, are you just going to point out to me the last time America had a democratic election, or that the UK
maybe never
had an election that wasn't interfered with? Or, if there's any inkling in the UK of a Labour leader that might actually be sympathetic to the resistance in Palestine, they're got rid of by the Israeli lobby. It's like, what planet are you on that you think you can judge the response of a country to re-elect its leader? It wasn't about re-electing Assad. It was about sticking two fingers up to the West and saying, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how many terrorists invade this country. It doesn't matter how many of our cities you destroy. It doesn't matter how much economic pressure you put on us. It doesn't matter how many of our resources you steal and you deprive us of. We are declaring that you are irrelevant to our future and to our self-determination. Yes. That's what that election was about. What is the point of calling yourself anti-imperialist and then kind of snubbing your nose at Syria and saying, yeah, but it's not democratic?
Well, and I've heard you speak on that before too, about how the support that Assad has gotten is not necessarily because the people worship him. It's the fact that he's willing to stand up against empire for his people.
And he stayed here.
Yes.
He stayed here. I think Kevork said at one point, ISIS were 20 kilometers away from his house.
Yeah.
And by the way, he doesn't live in some decadent palace, like Saddam Hussein used to. He lives in a relatively simple house in the middle of Damascus.
His kids are always dressed they don't dress super fancy. They're just they just seem
they're very humble.
People.
They're very, very humble, actually. And I'm reliably told that quite often late at night, when he can't sleep, he gets in his own car and drives himself around Damascus. And the checkpoints are kind of because you have to put your window down.
Can you imagine?
To take you out, and they're like,
can you imagine working a late night at the checkpoint and here comes the president, just cruising through?
But seriously, this is, I kind of wish I could immerse people in Syrian culture, just for, to really, all people here that you speak to, I mean, now this is anecdotal, but every single taxi driver, every single person I speak to will criticize the government. They hate a lot of the members of the government. And like any country, they'll complain about the electricity, they'll complain about the water, they'll complain about this, they'll complain about that. But when it comes to the president, all of them will kind of go, yeah, but the president's the red line. We don't cross that, right? And that's demonstrated by the intervention of the presidency in this kind of little mini drama that went on with the Syrian media outlet, right? You know, as it's how many people are here? Like 15 million, and yet somehow the president can just go, no, come on, guys, come to the table and like talk about it, you know?
Yeah. No, and I hadn't heard that. And I love that story because I mean, to me, doing what I do, that's like a wet dream. Like can you imagine if the United States had a president who actually gave a shit about free speech and press freedom? That'd be amazing.
Not even a president, just a congressman.
Just
a mayor, just a governor, just someone that would give a shit, right?
Yeah, just one would be cool. I mean, I'll take just one. We can start there.
You know, like how many times have you written in the UK, particularly, you write to your MP, your member of parliament. What do you get back? You just get back a kind of anodyne repetition of whatever government's in power foreign policy statement, right? You don't, I mean, here you really do get the impression. And I remember Leif telling me a story. I don't want to kind of misrepresent it, but basically his mother was protesting something and she decided to basically go outside the president's home and protest it. The president intervened. He sent someone down to speak to her to see what the problem was. He called the person she had the problem was and resolved everything.
Stop.
You should get Lathon and get him to tell you the whole story because I cried when I read it. I was just like, that's
amazing.
Ridiculous. It's amazing.
Yeah, I've reached out to him. I'd like to get him on. So
I can't imagine.
But get him to talk about these stories because he did publish it on Facebook, and I was so kind of like wowed by it. I loved it. So you should get them to talk about some of these stories.
Our elected officials actively avoid us. Like they will do anything to avoid a town hall or, you know, a conversation or a meeting. Like you can't get a meeting with your congressperson. It's impossible unless you're a lobbyist and you have money to offer. You can't. I've tried to get meetings with my congresspeople to ask them about Julian Assange. I've called. Every time I call, I get some aide who tells me, okay, we'll pass along the message. And I never hear anything back. I don't even get like so much as a form letter. And it's ridiculous. We don't have representation.
No. And you don't have any discussion. You don't have any recourse at all.
No. They're taking away what little we have as we speak. I mean, there are anti-protest laws. Yeah. I mean, there was a teacher in I think it was Texas who was fired because she wouldn't like proclaim her allegiance to Israel. That's where we're at. It's crazy. It's the United States that we claim to be all about free speech and, you know, freedom of thought and all this stuff. And we're hypocrites. We're liars.
And it's still happening everywhere. In the UK, David Miller was just fired from his position.
Exactly. Craig Murray's in prison.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nuts. It's nuts what's happening. And it's the Five Eyes country, really. I mean, if you look at what's happening, it's really the Five Eyes country they're all cracking down. If you look at Australia, New Zealand, everybody's cracking down on journalism. There was just a journalist who was detained in Mexico because he was going to cover the elections in I think Nicaragua, which by the way, I think Combo Couch is there covering those, which is great.
Right.
But yeah, there's a hardcore increase on the attacks on journalism and whistleblowing and truth, really just the truth.
Well, I mean, there has been throughout the war against Syria, and now of course it's ramping up with the whole COVID project. You know, we're all saying mass censorship. I'm banned for 7 days on Twitter because I posted about Biden killing kids with vaccinations. You know, you're not allowed to kind of point out that the president of the US is involved in mass murder.
Well, and people are self-censoring on that too. They won't cover it. They won't, like, there's very few channels who are willing to even say the word COVID on their channel. Like people are like calling it the vaccine, like Pasta and Fee call it the boop boop. And people are like scared to even talk about it, like to even mention it, because you'll lose your channel. You'll lose everything. And it's nuts. It's crazy that this is a huge deal. And the fact that they're trying so desperately to limit the conversation should be a red fucking flag, y'all. That should be a red flag to me. As soon as they started, because when COVID first started, I didn't really know what was going on. I think like most of us, we were like, what the fuck is this? What's happening? Like, it was very confusing for a while. But then when they started really clamping down on what you were allowed to talk about, I was like, okay, this is bullshit. It's bullshit, clearly, because if it wasn't, they'd let us have these conversations.
Well, I mean, a real pandemic doesn't need multi-million marketing.
Right.
Right.
You know?
And if you look at the numbers that are customarily used to quantify and qualify a pandemic, those numbers were never reached and have not been reached for COVID-19 to be an official pandemic, according to the WHO's own standards. But nonetheless, it was touted as a pandemic by Tedros, and from there it went. And now the most despicable act in the whole play, I think, has just taken place with approving this poison substance for kids, for children.
They're not coming anywhere near my fucking kids.
And they want to, the vaccine regime wants to get it so that eventually 6-month-olds can receive the vaccine. You know, we're talking about a portion of the population for which this vaccine is completely unnecessary. With regard to their immune systems, with regard to their chances of contracting and either getting
severe
hospitalized
illness,
or dying for COVID. The chance is, if you use the Oxford calculator, which suspiciously only lets you go down to age 19, but if you go with age 19 and no comorbidities, your chance of dying from COVID-19 is 1 in a million. So that's 0.00001% chance of dying.
On the flip side of that, I wonder what the percentage, like the potential for adverse reaction to the vaccine is. Like, I'm just curious because I know, like, for example, measles, the risk reward ratio for getting the vaccine might make sense. You know what I mean? Because there's like a 1 in a million chance you're going to have an adverse reaction, but like 1 in 10,000 cases of measles ends up in hospitalization. So that might make sense. Again, that's your personal choice. You make your own decision. But, you know, I'm just curious, like seeing all of these, the heart issues that I've noticed that there's been an uptick in articles coming out about how kids are having heart problems, and it's like we're being groomed for this potential problem that they're trying to force upon us. And anytime, I'm not anti-vax at all, but anytime somebody wants to try to mandate what I can put in my body, literally inject into my body, you can fuck off.
That's the whole point. I mean, it's not, you know, members of my family have taken the vaccination.
My husband's vaccinated. It's fine. Like, it's his choice.
Exactly.
I got the first 2 shots, and I'm still experiencing negative effects from it. Almost 3 months later.
Jesse
now.
Kind of regrets it like now, but
I do regret it, and it's why I've become very vocal.
You have
against it, and I've been trying to stick to the science as much as I can, looking at the reports, listening to the doctors
which is incredibly difficult to do because all of the numbers that we're given, it's all kind of manufactured. You're only allowed access to certain information, and then anybody who tries to get other information out there, they're censored and they're taken off of Twitter and they're, you know, demonetized or banned or whatever. And again, that should be a huge red flag to anybody who's trying to find the facts on COVID.
But also, you know, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean, it's like all of these VAERS websites and the MHRA in the UK that are supposed to be a red flag, right? That's what they're there for, as an alarm to the pharmaceutical industry that perhaps there's a problem with the vaccine. Now, there are literally thousands of reports. And if you consider, I mean, people kind of vary, but a lot of people land on the fact that there's probably only 1% of the actual adverse reactions that are being reported, right? So that's extraordinary. That if you, I mean, that's scary if you extrapolate that out, right?
Yeah.
Because that's terrifying. And why is nobody allowing a discussion about this?
right?
That's the thing, everyone is just clamping down on it.
Well, that's when Jimmy Dore, so he got vaccinated, he experienced side effects. He openly spoke about those side effects and people were trashing him. And I'm like, wait, wouldn't you want somebody who got the vaccine, if you want to make it safe and effective and make it the best that it can be, wouldn't you want people to speak out about their adverse reactions so that we can try to tweak it and try to figure out but no, people, I mean, he got bashed. He still gets bashed regularly. He's vaccinated and people will call him anti-vax. Like, what? And they've changed the word. They redefined anti-vax. They changed the definition for vaccine and they changed the definition for anti-vaxxer. And that's, you don't get to just change the definitions of words to fit your narrative. That's fucking creepy.
Well, it's because it's not about health. It's not about a reliable vaccine.
If it was about health, we would have healthcare in this country.
It's about it's about control by a globalist class, and we know who the players are: the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Economic
they're so
Forum.
Creepy. God, they creep me out.
There's a litany of players who are trying to impose upon us and make us serfs under the Great Reset, the Fourth Industrial Revolution. These
you will eat bugs and you will like it.
Yeah, these globalist class
human cell meat.
Yeah.
And the vaccine is simply a means for setting up a social credit system.
We're being groomed. We are being groomed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Their control of us is centralized as much as it possibly can be.
But it's also you're being, somebody pointed this out to me here. I mean, I was already aware of it. And he's actually a doctor. He said, like, you're basically just being made a captive agent of Big Pharma. Because the side effects of the vaccine are going to require medication. And then, of course, now they're talking booster shots ad infinitum, right? They're talking, I don't know how many variants we're on now.
I joked when this first came out, I joked that we were going to get one of those get 10 shots, the 11th one's free cards. You know what I mean? And now here we are. And I'm like, that was a joke. I was joking.
No, but it's it's really kind of scary where we're heading. And I think my point always is, freedom of choice. If people really genuine feel that they need the vaccine, they trust the vaccine, fine.
Have
that's
a conversation with your personal physician.
I'm not going to argue that with anyone. But my point is, if you allow this to become mandatory, what is going to become mandatory in the future that perhaps you disagree with?
Yes.
Right? This is the point. It's like, what's your red line? What's your boundary? What's the point where you say, no, I'm not having that injected into my body.
They want to inject you with an RFID chip.
Process,
yeah.
Yeah,
no, it's scary. It's scary, the level of control that they're attempting to grab. And really, they're being incredibly effective. There are so many people, and I understand. I try to be patient with people because it's fear. They're scaring people.
Gaslighting.
Yes, and people will do a lot of really unintelligent things when they're scared, and that's why they use fear as a manipulation tool. You know what I mean? So I get it. Like, I understand, and that's why I'm never going to come fight you if you want to go get vaccinated, ever. I'm not gonna question you. I'm not going, when Jesse got vaccinated, I didn't say a word about it. I'm like, that's your choice, dude. When my husband wanted to go get vaccinated, I'm like, that's your choice, dude, go do it. But I'm not gonna, you don't get to tell me that I have to go get vaccinated. That's not okay. And you certainly don't get to tell me that I have to have my children injected. Fuck off.
Yeah, and getting back to Syria, it really speaks of the hypocrisy of these self-styled journalists who constantly lambast Syria as being a police state when the West is becoming the ultimate police.
That is such a good point.
Minute by minute, it's becoming the ultimate police state.
Yeah, and
you look what's been happening in Australia. It's hell.
Oh God.
It's
and
hell.
A lot of those journalists are not even talking about it.
Yeah.
Even Iraqis who emigrated to Australia are now going back to Iraq because it's that bad. It's that repressive. And
I actually know of Syrians that are coming back here because of this.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that they always test it out in Australia. And then they bring it here. Like, they test it out somewhere else. They figure out how to get people on board and to get people to cooperate, and then they bring it here.
Yeah, I think it was Patrick Henningsen on the UK column newscast the other day.
They're amazing.
Yeah, I saw you on there last Wednesday.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to dovetail off of a question they asked you on that program. But he said essentially, if it was him, it might have been one of the other presenters on there. But he said that Australia is essentially the beta version of what's in store for all of us if we keep going along with this. Not that Australians are going along with it. They're
fighting back.
By and large, fighting back tooth and nail. But
kudos to you.
That brings me to the question that I think you were asked this very same question, but I'd still like to ask it anyway.
Sure.
In Syria, what has the response been to COVID-19? And in general, all of the things we just talked about, what's the atmosphere there? Because in the West, obviously, it's fear ad nauseum and disinformation ad nauseum.
Well, I mean, I think, as I've said time and time again, the majority of Syrians have a lot more to worry about than corona. They've gone through a 10-year war. They have heavy economic sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. They're rebuilding their country. Their friendly neighbors are also under attack, like Lebanon, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, they're living through a kind of hell. So, as far as they're concerned, corona is a little bit low on the list of priorities, to be honest. As I said in the beginning, in 2020, the president did impose a curfew, but not for very long, because he decided that the effect on the economy was far more dangerous than a virus affecting the population. And actually, the number of deaths in Syria is kind of ridiculously low. And you have to remember that, as I said on UK column, that those figures are being inflated. I think Mike tried to make a correlation, and there is a correlation between an uptick in the corona deaths and the introduction of the vaccination in Syria. But there's also the fact that in Idlib, of course, they're kind of marketing corona there and talking about cases in the refugee camps, all of this to impact on the Syrian government. And of course, let's not forget, the kind of multi-million funding of the White Helmet organization that are now allegedly producing PPE in Idlib for so
of course
it's sort of, those figures are a little bit difficult to take terribly seriously. At the same time, of course, some people are concerned, just as they are in the West, but the media here is kind of not as rampant as it is in the West, because the whole narrative is being controlled predominantly from the West. Of course, I do tend to see what's happening right now as a kind of transnational corporatocracy predator class that is conducting this experiment on all of humankind. And some governments may be less inclined to be a part of that, or they may be being excluded, etc. So I would say in Syria, the reaction has been sensible. It's been balanced and sensible. For example, if I go out in the streets and I go into a shop and someone's wearing a mask, nobody has a go at me because I'm not wearing a mask. There's none of this kind of division that is being fomented in the global north, for example, or in the UK or EU or US. I mean, I can't quite believe what human beings are kind of doing to each other.
It's amazing. People are like disowning family members because they won't get vaccinated. What is wrong with you?
It's insane. And, we're coming back full circle to the police state thing. I mean, it's crazy. I've told this story time and time again. A couple of times I've gone to a military institution and the guy in the front kind of has his mask on and he says to me, okay, you need to put a mask on. I'm like, no.
Thanks
I
anyway.
have medical exemption written, and he's like, okay, just go through. I go through. No one in the building is wearing a mask. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the science is out. The masks don't do anything to prevent you from contracting or spreading.
No, and they're disgusting, to be honest. Like
Yes.
you're breathing and coughing and spluttering into this thing all day, and then you're wiping it up and down your. I mean, sometimes I just think, how can people think this is normal?
And then to make what really bothers me in the US, and especially people who are like mask Nazis, because it is kind of Nazi-esque, but they want to make my kids wear a mask in school for 8 hours a day. But like, at the Met Gala, there's nobody, but only the servants were wearing masks.
Yeah.
At Nancy Pelosi has this big fancy dinner. Only the servants are wearing masks, and we're being conditioned for that to be like an okay thing, where it's only the servants who have to abide by those rules. There's only people who those rules apply to, and that's not okay. That, first of all, that's again should be a huge red flag. That's an enormous amount of hypocrisy. And another one that I loved, you mentioned having curfews. My favorite was when they were like, okay, well, everything has to shut down at like 10 o'clock, and I'm like, okay, so what? COVID's a night owl? Like, what the fuck does that even mean?
Yeah, the virus doesn't go out at night.
Right? Like, what does that even mean? Everything was all of the rules were so arbitrary and selectively applied that it was very clearly bullshit,
And remember when everyone was in lockdown and suddenly Floyd happened?
Yeah.
And suddenly everyone's allowed out on the street.
Right. Yeah. Protests were fine. And then that was fine. But like people would go to a NASCAR race and they would call it a super spreader event.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm fine with both of those things. I'm glad people were out in the streets protesting. I wish that would happen more often.
They tried to call the elections here a super spreader event.
Right. Yes.
We
shut down a primary here.
Which defies science, because we know that this is a virus that spreads primarily indoors. If you look at the work that the group Panda has done, I don't know if you're familiar with Panda.
It's the brother of a friend of mine, actually.
Nick Hudson in particular. Both have done very good work dispelling a lot of these myths. But I think everything that's rolled out is a test to see how far this globalist class can push us, to see what we'll be susceptible to. So if you look at Whitney Webb's reporting, for example, she goes into the Wellcome Trust, for example, and their Welcome Leap agenda, and how they eventually want to study the brains of 3-month-olds to essentially develop the perfect brain. And she
so creepy.
She asked in one interview I watched, who would put their children up for this sort of experiment. And before she could answer exactly what I was thinking, I thought, well, it's the same parents who are going to put their kids up for these trials, these 5 to 11-year-old kids up for these trials for the vaccine.
Exactly.
And then that's
and they're kind of cheering them on. I mean,
I saw one parent tweet that we're so blessed that little Timmy is able to take part in this trial. What? Like you're using your kid as like a human experiment. Like, and again, I'm not anti-vaccine at all, but that's to like, they don't even know what happens to kids.
This isn't a vaccine. This is a complete experimental drug.
Yeah.
And as far as Moderna goes, in Moderna's entire existence, this is the only drug it's successfully brought to market in its entire existence. And
look at the history of all the vaccines. Look at the history of the really bad history of Pfizer, for example. How many kind of multi-million or even billion
Johnson and Johnson?
Moderna. I mean, Whitney did a fantastic piece on Moderna, like exposing its really like filthy practices, and I mean, they're hideous, these companies.
Yes, and they're protected by immunity.
Exactly. This is my point. Like, are you really going to give your kid an experimental drug? And if anything goes wrong, you have absolutely the big pharma has complete immunity. I mean, Sorry.
Yeah, no.
I didn't mean that pun, but they do.
And not only that, these companies, Pfizer in particular now, they're essentially able to move into countries like Argentina and Brazil and blackmail these countries. I encourage everybody to look into what stipulations Pfizer has set up with these countries, essentially forcing the countries to put up their own assets, their own governmental assets as collateral, as an insurance policy that Pfizer can draw from if need be. Never mind the fact that they already have no liability. But yeah, it really speaks to the hypocrisy of people who want to talk about Syria as a police state, as the West is becoming the worst police state in human history.
Look at France. I mean, France and the Yellow Vest movement has been ongoing for years now. I mean, I was still in France, so that was what 2018, I think they started. And you know, I was on protests there before I came to Syria. And I've been to plenty of really kind of serious hot zones, but I was terrified in Paris when the police kind of kettled us in the Place de la République and just started moving in and then started firing tear gas. And then if people were trying to break out, they were shooting rubber bullets at them. I mean, this is kind of IDF tactics.
Yes.
Right.
And they train our cops.
Yeah. And, you know, if Macron goes out in the street, he gets slapped or eggs thrown at him. You know, so I'm sorry, you know, I'm really getting a little bit fed up, you know, because when you look at the history, please, I recommend people to read the article because I've really tried not to kind of put a slant on it. I've just given you the facts. And when a country like Syria that was progressive and stable and secure and peaceful prior to 2011 has been reduced to a kind of quasi-failed state. It's not a failed state because the president has remained in place. He has remained absolutely steadfast. If you read his speeches from 2011 until now, he has never faltered. He has never done a U-turn. He has always been very forthcoming. And I'll tell you actually quickly another very quick story. A friend of mine had actually organized an interview with an American journalist with the president. And generally, they have to present the questions before they go in so the president can prepare himself. And at this particular point, the journalist brought out the photo. You remember the dusty boy, Omar Daknish. The whole story was proven later, particularly by myself and Eva Bartlett, to be totally fraudulent, and by the family of the boy. But he brought out the photo. And my friend immediately was kind of worried because the president hadn't been prepared for it. And he asked, should we stop filming? And the president said, no, like, I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone puts to me, right? I challenge you to find a politician in the West that is going to respond like that to a very litigious question that is just suddenly thrown at them. You know, really, this country has suffered for 10 years and it's still suffering. It needs people to step up to the plate. Stop with the arrogance saying this is not a democratic country. Even if it isn't a democratic country, how the hell does it have a chance to become, you know, whatever a democratic country is? Exactly. You're not living in a democratic country. You're living in a totalitarian state, and you're not even talking about that. You're not even addressing the issues at home. You're not addressing, you know, the multiple police state atrocities committed by your own bipartisan regimes.
And our own interference in the country of Syria that has caused it to be in turmoil.
Exactly.
Take some ownership of that.
Like, back off. Let these people breathe. You know, okay, I do take it personally. I live here.
Yeah.
Right. So I suffer the consequences in a way. I'm not as damaged by what has gone on as the people here are, but I see it every day. I see the kids in the big wheelie bin, waste bins, picking through to find food to eat, right? You would never have seen that even 4 years ago. You didn't see it. So stop. Like what is it with looking for something to condemn this country when it's already been condemned since 1916?
Yeah.
It's been consistently and systematically under attack for almost a century. Let it breathe, focus on your own issues.
And let it have
home.
self-determination. It's not our concern. Stay the fuck out of it. The U.S. is not the world's babysitter. We certainly have no business being the world's babysitter. We can't even take care of it. We have a homeless epidemic. We don't have healthcare in this country. We have our own problems to deal with. We have no business telling Syria what they need to do.
You can't, for example, people throw at me, yeah, but it was a black site for the CIA. Yeah, look at the point in history that this came into existence. At a point when Syria was trying to normalize relations with the West. It has always tried to normalize relations with the West because it's aware of how much of a threat the West is to the existence of Syria, right? And so, therefore, it admitted this also at that point, or shortly after. It came under very heavy sanctions for its support of Hezbollah and Hamas, who were then designated, of course, terrorist organizations because they threatened the security of Israel, but also for its alleged support of the PKK. Now the US is supporting the PKK to basically partition Syria. So, the sheer hypocrisy of the United States. The United States has just lifted economic sanctions. Why? Because Damascus has just reintegrated data back into Syria, releasing the pipeline that traverses the southern area of Dara city in the countryside of Dara. And so suddenly the US is thinking, shit, we need to get fuel and energy from Egypt through Jordan, through Syria, into Lebanon, so that Hezbollah isn't the only one bringing fuel in from Iran, because we don't want Iranian influence having a positive effect in Lebanon. So guess what? They've partially lifted the sanctions to enable the pipeline to pass through Syria and into Lebanon. Come on. History should have taught us by now that almost everything US media or UK media says are lies fed to them by the intelligence agencies.
Yes.
So why are you just regurgitating those lies without looking at the historical context or without speaking to people that have the historical context?
Yes.
Yeah, and as far as illuminating those lies, I think we'd be remiss not to very much thank Julian Assange and WikiLeaks for bringing a lot of this treachery and duplicity to light. A lot of the cables that have been released through WikiLeaks have been very helpful.
Exactly. Yeah, and they're
thank
all
you, Julian.
listed.
And he's being tortured to death currently. Good.
No, I mean they're all listed. Pretty much all of them are listed in the articles.
Yep. Yeah.
So before we let you go, I just wanted to touch on the piece you recently wrote for RT, Israel attacks Syria in broad daylight. We shouldn't actively ignore it. And you were actually witness to one of these recent strikes.
I was bombed.
So scary.
So reading through that piece, of course, I was struck by the fact that this was the first daylight bombing by Israel, but also something I didn't know, that Israel has been using civilian aircraft as human shields to carry out a lot of these bombing operations. So can you talk about what happened recently in the past week or so?
You mean the actual bombing that I was involved in, or the ones using civilian aircraft?
So there was a series on October 30 and then on November 3rd, if I'm not mistaken. And
November 3rd was the daylight bombing.
Okay. Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, the daylight bombing was an area or air defense base about 2-3 kilometers west of where I live. And I go there every day to walk the dogs because there's a disused airfield and there's kind of grass areas around, and finding that kind of area here is quite difficult. So I take the dogs there and go walking every day. And on this particular day, I was actually crossing. There's also a racetrack for horses in the center of the area. So the air defense base kind of surrounds the old disused runway, and the racetrack. And I can hear what I think are jets, right? Because it's that kind of sound. And I'm thinking, okay, that's weird. There's no planes left on this base. So I'm wondering what the noise is. Suddenly, this massive explosion. I mean, literally, probably just over 100 meters from where I am. The dogs completely freaked out. There was just molten metal being flung up into the air, and I can still hear. Then I realize, of course, it's not planes, they're winged missiles, so there's more incoming. So after that, there were probably about 4 or 5 further actual landing of the missiles, because some of them were brought down by the air defense that was then activated. But what was unusual about this attack is it's daytime. Normally, Israel will attack after midnight, so between midnight and 5 in the... Oh, I mean, you still got me?
Yeah,
you froze up.
Yeah, all right. Might be my internet. It might be giving up the ghost now.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, we won't keep it for much longer.
Had it been an hour earlier, there would have been dozens, if not more, civilians, trainers, jockeys, horses, all on the track. As it was, there were about 100 civilians having a meeting in the seating, which was only a few meters from where the first missile actually hit. So it would have been carnage had the missile kind of missed its point. Now, of course, and this is what always happens, Israel puts out the story that it's Hezbollah or Iranian militia that they're targeting. That's then picked up and copy-pasted by almost every single Western media outlet, from the BBC to CNN to whatever. So they basically just take the Israeli justification for unlawful aggression on a regular basis. And of course, they don't condemn it. Neither does the UN. In fact, it's very rarely, I don't even know if that attack was reported in the mainstream media. And there was another attack a couple of days later, but at around 12:15 in the morning. But you're right about the using civilian aircraft. I think the one you're talking about was on October the 13th. Where they use civilian aircraft to as cover to fire air to ground missiles from the cover of Al Tanf base, the US Al Tanf base on the border with Jordan. So that means that the US was aware and complicit with this attack and the use of the civilian aircraft.
Illegal military.
To target a command control center. To the east of Palmyra. Prior to that, there was the famous shooting down in 2018 of the Russian plane carrying, I think it was 15 Russian personnel, because it basically crossed over with the Syrian air defense firing at the incoming missiles, and Israel was perfectly aware that the Russian plane would be crossing at that time. The attack on Palmyra, by the way, the air defense actually didn't respond because I think it was multiple civilian aircraft and they were too afraid of bringing down civilian aircraft. And of course, to some extent, that's what Israel wants. It wants an international incident in Syria. Look, Syria has shot down, it's killed 170 civilians, et cetera, et cetera. That's what it wants. And
very reminiscent of what we saw in Crimea in 2014 when the Malaysia airplane was shot down.
Exactly. Yeah. The MH. No,
Got to
was that the
manufacture that consent
MH17?
somehow, y'all.
I think it was
Yeah.
MH17.
I think so. Yeah.
And then of course the major one, and I'm trying to remember. I think I can't remember if that was 2020 or 2021, when there was actually a Syrian Airbus 320 coming in from Tehran with 172 people on board, and Israel launched an attack. And it was only thanks to the swift reactions of the Damascus air traffic control center that managed to divert the plane to Hama, to the Russian base in Tartus on the coast, on the Syrian coast, Mediterranean coast, that saved the lives of those 172 passengers. So yeah, and there was another incident, I think, with an Ethiopian airline that was also kind of caught up in the crossfire. And again, it was purely down to the Syrian air defense not hitting it, rather than Israel. Israel failed to warn the pilot of the plane that there was an incoming attack. So it completely put the lives of civilians at risk. And effectively, of course, what it's doing, which it does traditionally anyway, it's using civilians as human shields.
Yeah. And it's launching a lot of these strikes from Lebanese airspace.
Yeah, Lebanese airspace. We tend to actually pick up on Twitter because there's, I think it's Lebanese News and Updates. It's a really good Twitter account worth following. But he always picks up on kind of extra movement by Israeli planes in Lebanese airspace, particularly on the border. So he usually gives us a bit of a head of the potential of an air attack. But it's also important that the Palmyra attack, which of course was responded to by the resistance. Also, this is another thing that is setting a precedent, because Syed Nasrallah had said fairly recently that, you know, we're going to be retaliating. This isn't going to be allowed. If you attack, we will attack back. And actually, they did attack the US base, and they caused pretty good material damage to Al Tanf base, because, as I said, Israel launched from America has a 55-kilometer exclusion zone around Al Tanf camp. They have absolutely no legal right to do so. Al Tanf camp is, you know, totally unlawful occupation of Syrian territory. But they have actually put a 55-kilometer exclusion zone around the camp, where they train armed groups in heavy artillery, etc., which are supplied by the US, such as the HIMARS artillery that have a range of around 300 kilometers. So, in theory, they could target Damascus from there. But the fact that Israel is launching from Al Tanf means, of course, that the US is completely complicit in these attacks, and complicit in the criminal use of civilian aircraft as cover for the missile launches.
We're illegally occupying Syria, but they're the police state.
We're the police state.
Yeah. 100%. That's how that works. So I have dropped the links to both of the articles in the chat, everybody. So if you are watching, or if you're watching later, the links are in the chat. They're also in the show notes. Definitely check out both of the articles that we just discussed today. The 75 years and counting one, seriously, it's really great. Again, like we said, there's no way that you could fit like the entirety of Syrian history into one article. But as far as like an article goes, it is very comprehensive. There's a lot of information in there that most Americans probably have no idea about, unless you're actively involved in researching it. And if you're looking for information on Syria, talk to Syrians, or go search out shows that interview actual Syrians, because that's how you're going to get the most, credible information, because the United States media is crap. So yeah, go talk to Syrians, go watch shows that are talking to Syrians, or people who are living in Syria, people who have been in Syria, who have, like Vanessa is doing, has lived there for 2 years, and you know what I mean? So that's the kind of people you want to seek out for information, for sure. So thank you for coming on. I appreciate you coming on and talking about this. We'd love to have you back anytime to further the conversation, because I don't think Syria is getting enough. More people need to be talking about it. I think that, we're kind of, they've been under attack for so long, but I feel like, there's always that kind of threat, like there seems like it's building.
There is potential for serious military escalation right now. We're all kind of a little bit on edge here, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because Turkey's building up its presence. America, Israel, Iran is becoming much more belligerent towards Israel, and Syria's kind of bang in the middle.
It feels like everything's boiling right now. Do you know what I mean? So I think that, the more we can talk about this, the better, because I think that we have to get people better informed for sure. And that's not to say that I am, y'all. That's why we have Vanessa here.
No, and I think, with all the corona hysteria, I think it's really important to keep our eye on the ball as well, because there are
a lot of people are distracted.
Global wars going on. Yeah. Yeah, I've even had people say to me, "Oh, why are you still talking about Syria?"
Oh, yeah.
Well, but thanks for having me on. I really
thanks for coming. We really appreciate it. And again, we're happy to have you back anytime. Thanks to everybody in the chat for hanging out with us on our live stream. I'm a tech genius, and we will be back tomorrow, right, Jesse? We have another one tomorrow at noon.
Yeah, tomorrow we'll have Piers Robinson on. So we'll be talking about
COVID.
A lot of the propaganda surrounding the COVID narrative.
So if our channel gets shut down after tomorrow, you'll know why. So thanks, Vanessa. We appreciate you. Yeah. Okay. And we'll talk to you later. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks,
See you tomorrow.
Vanessa. Thanks, everybody.